Chapter 40. The Price of a Life. The moment the defenses at the bridge fell, hundreds of Talgarth troops rushed across it and poured onto the grassy area before the city wall. The assault of the wildcat beasts was too swift and strong, and Olam's plan to ignite the bridge before it was taken had utterly failed. As a result, all of the fighters below, both friend and foe, poured into the space before the wall, fighting desperately in their last stand. Elastra pounded her fists on the stone and growled. She and their other wardens were not given the chance to use their strong hexes, and doing so now would kill just as many Faldetians. Even Anselm shook his head in disappointment at losing their last chance at an effective counterstrike. "Fate take them!" cried Elastra. She turned and shouted new commands down the wall. "All wardens, unleash any hex you've got that does not risk the life of a countryman, and ready your swords. Prepare for the worst. This is Paladar's last stand. Send down death upon them. Let them feel the wrath of the order of deities." Anselm spotted the armored men of Paladar everywhere amongst the enemy, trying to cut them down with the desperate brutality of men with lost hope. He saw groups of Gruuls and some men get across the river, and some of them ran to the left and right around to other sides of the city wall, but he ignored them. There was no other way into the city. The mighty Satyr beasts continued their parade, and he saw a few tearing at the bases of the bridge towers and ramming against them with their curled horns. He joined the other wardens and closed his eyes in focus and formed a first-degree hex with his fingers. He felt the heat build in the scar on his left palm, and the inclination that some small thought had just left his mind before the power boiled to the surface. He pointed his hands straight down toward the base of the wall, and let a surge of fire spill onto a tightly huddled group of Talgarth men trying to scale the stones. Elastra ran back and forth along the wall seeking enemy clusters, while her hands switched back and forth indecisively between first and second-degree formations. She attacked where she could with laughs and taunts, and Anselm smiled, fueled by her enthusiasm. She gravitated to one area where a Satyr wildcat had finished off a group of victims, and was left alone for a brief moment. "Brother," she called. Anselm sprang to her side just as she made the formation of a second-degree hex. He followed her lead without even looking down, knowing she had found a window of opportunity, and as one they took it. A web of white lightning streaked down the wall with a deafening clap, and traveled through the creature's body into the ground beneath it. The beast dropped onto its side instantly and could not so much as cry out before an eruption of earth followed, blasting its fallen shape into pieces. Leothran stood by with her swords drawn, waiting for any of the Talgathians to reach the top of the wall. Many ladders that were placed against the wall were quickly tipped by a nearby warden or defender, though several stood long enough to allow 15 or 20 foes up. Leothran dashed to and fro as each came atop the wall, and ended them before they could fell any of the wardens. The invaders were equipped with individual ropes tipped with multiple metal hooks. 100 soared over the precipice in minutes and latched on tightly to the edge, allowing Gruuls and Talgathians to reach the top and start attacking wardens. Leothran began cutting the new ropes that came up after just enough time for a group of enemies to climb halfway up, letting them fall to their deaths, but there were far too many ropes and too few defenders to get to them all in time. The number of Talgathians atop the wall increased at terrible speed. As the lower-ranking wardens grew weary from hex casting, they drew their swords and began to fight off the red cloaks with brute strength, which proved largely unsuccessful, as few of them had enough training with melee weapons and close combat. Anselm shook his head and growled as he watched them slowly losing ground. He ran to a nearby rope and took hold of it while making a hex formation, and sent a strong tremor down its length which whipped the climbers off like bugs falling from a branch. Eventually he, too, decided to save his strength in case an appropriate situation came for a high-degree hex, and took up his sword, running it through Gruuls all around him. He saw that Elastra noticed him do so, but she shook her head and continued with the hexes as a huddle of defenders protected her. Swords were never her style. He looked down the narrow pathway atop the wall, to see hundreds now scattered all around in combat. Swords and spears rang as loudly as the hexes firing off through the night, and he scanned the scene before him in search of Leothran. He chose to move left since that was the direction he had seen her last, and cut his way down the line, carefully choosing the weaker opponents. "Fate curse me for neglecting swordsmanship. It will be the end of me." He took special care to break off of his chosen path to help a fellow warden in need or to defend some that were unaware and still casting destruction down to the bridge, but all the while his eyes were searching for the long black hair and yellow eye. There was no sign. It had been long since Palsson had been able to use his sword with full force. Now it was his chance to take revenge. The mere thought of Mayor Zuck made him more furious, and he allowed himself now in the midst of the chaos to let his anger surface. He wore scarce armor himself, Master Vasero never fancied it, and Palsson did not need it. Whenever Paladar warriors engaged him, swinging their heavy swords and axes, he easily ducked and dodged away, parrying with quick thrusts to the joints at their armor under the arms and at the hips. It was all too easy. He had left his horse once the bridge was taken, and was slowly making his way across it toward the wall. He saw Mayor Zuck up ahead, following orders for once and screaming at his ghouls to bring more ladders and ropes. He turned his gaze away and up to the top of the torchlit wall. "You're up there somewhere, Shadow Walker. You cannot hide." He spun in a circle around the lunging Faldetian, and ended him with 2 clean swipes across his back. "I don't care whether this futile war is won or lost. Damn Talgarth and its lioness. As long as I have your head on the end of my blade, that is enough." He fought his way across the bridge, and reached the crowded area before the wall. He could only spot a handful of the Satyr left, and the thought crossed his mind to put his own sword through one if he had the chance. Tall fires blazed here and there from the wardens far above him, and he traveled through the more densely mixed area of the battle, knowing he could avoid much of the risk of being hit. His swordsman mind was active and alert. He moved in and out of the empty spaces of the battle as if in a dance, and saw everything around him at once. One by one he slashed his blade across stomachs and throats, even those of a few ghouls for good measure, only deflecting weapons once or twice all the way until he reached the wall. He threw his back against it and made sure there was no immediate danger before he took 2 hooked ropes from his belt, ensuring safety if one was cut while he was climbing. Returning his sword to his side, he carefully threw each one up, keeping them 6 spans apart from the other and tugging to make sure they were secure, started to climb. He grasped one with both hands but had the other looped onto his belt. Steadily he rose as one hand went above the other in a continuous motion, and he was grateful again that he had not worn a heavy breastplate or metal footwear. He felt the tension on his rope quiver, and without a second's delay, the rope looped on his belt came free and he switched, swinging 10 paces to the left to safety as his first rope was cut and fell to the ground far below him. He cursed under his breath and doubled his climbing speed, throwing his weight back and forth so that each arm could grab 2 or 3 paces higher each time. Just as he was reaching the top, he felt the same quivering in his rope, and made a final lunge to grab the stone of the wall. With one movement he heaved himself up and seized by the throat the warden who was working on the rope with his dagger, and tossed him over the edge. "Now, Satyr. You are mine." He looked for the yellow eye as he felled man after man who stood in his way. As he set a course to the left to head toward the area above the gate, several men recognized him there and ran to his side, but he pushed all of them away. "Go," he shouted to them. "The battle is not here. Leave me." He saw their confused faces as they rushed away but didn't care in the least what they thought. The last order he had given at the bridge was to kill all of the Faldetians until no more stood. It was a decent order to inspire victory in the minds of his troops at that time, but hardly a sufficient command for the duration of the battle. He knew they needed leadership and unification to win. They needed their general, but he didn't care. The Queen had given him a horde of filthy, untrained ghouls and a handful of shadow walkers. She could not expect to take one of the mightiest nations in the Westerlands with that. He knew now the battle would prove to be a defeat for Talgarth. Be that as it may. I never wanted this. Suddenly he saw her. There she was, not 50 spans off in front of him, whirling with her 2 swords and her eye twinkling gold with the light from the torches. He cut a straight path toward her and reset his mind, readying himself for a most worthy foe. "Shadow Walker," he shouted at her. At once the Satyr woman was facing him and plunging her swords at his face and stomach. He fended off each blow with excellent precision, and let his feet guide him to the safe areas around her circle. He intended to employ a tactic that fit this woman well, let her attack and do the work. Let her wear herself down and weaken, then strike. She had been fighting much longer than himself this night, and he was impressed by the strength and accuracy she still managed to maintain, but he could tell she was tired, and he let a few chances to strike pass him by, patiently waiting for the right moment. Despite his plans, he did have to work hard to keep her swords from landing a fatal blow. Countless times one of her blades slipped past his handguard and caught his fingers. One of her cuts even hit its mark on his thigh, although it was only a half-hearted attack and did little to slow his parries. "You have lost," the Satyr woman said between breaths as she continued her assailant. "Even now your men are fleeing the wall. Your beasts below have fallen and your gruels will not last the night." "I care not," Palsson retorted, keeping his guard. "My victory lies only in the spilling of your blood, dragon." His thoughts fumed, and for one small moment his tiny glass box flashed through his mind and emotions pushed him to action. It was time to end the conflict. He suddenly lashed out and struck at her head. One of her swords was there immediately to stop it, and she sent her other down low, directed at his leg. Before it reached him, instead of retreating, Palsson rushed forward and crashed his body into hers, simultaneously pushing and flinging her blocking sword out of her hand. The other near his leg left her grasp as his weight sent her falling backward to the cold stone. Her breath was stolen. While the moment of opportunity lasted, Palsson dropped his own sword and picked her up with both hands by the neck and hung her over the edge of the wall. "You're mine, Shadow Walker," he cried. The box and little trinkets inside glimmered in his memory. "This is for my wife and daughter." Anselm was covered in sweat and dashes of blood. He had gone too far from Elastra now to see if she was still all right. From what he could tell, the battle had turned again, and his instincts told him that the Satyr below had all been defeated. If that were true, he thought, Olam and Caleb would be able to retake the bridge and end the conflict. "Leo!" he shouted as he ran. He had been shouting for a while now, but there had been no answer. Reluctantly, he had started to check bodies as he went. Hope began to drain from him, but as he ran his blade through the back of a red cloak, the path before him cleared, and at last he saw her. He stopped dead and nearly dropped his sword. A man was holding her by the throat, over the side of the wall. His blood surged with adrenaline, but just as his feet began to move, a gruel jumped onto his back and knocked him to the ground. Gruels were never fazed easily, but this one screamed with fear at the frantic strength he met in Anselm. He wrestled back on top of the thing, and got to his feet again, throwing the creature over the edge of the wall, all the while the image of Leothran hanging helplessly burned into his eyes. He whirled around and their eyes met. Time stood still, and he watched as she lost consciousness. The man released his grip. She fell. The fighting and noise all around him disappeared, and it seemed for 1,000 years that he was standing there all alone, watching her fall inches every hour that passed. "She's gone. I failed her. Leothran is dead, and it's all my fault. Unless—" An idea came. Anselm didn't think. He dug into his satchel and yanked free what he sought. The Seer Tarn. For the first time he had found a risk worth taking. He put it on. Anselm's vision vanished. Blackness engulfed him. His ears filled with the blasting of the loudest sound he had ever heard. Deep roars boomed in and out and through his body like the oceans of all the water in existence were raging on top of him, wrenching him to and fro, bringing him to his knees. All at once an infinite surge of emotions traveled through his soul at the speed of light, stretching and expanding as they forced their way in. Intense pain, anguish, happiness, calm, deep misery, sadness, and everything in between. He felt Leothran, although he could not see her. He felt her weightlessness as she traveled through the air, and the vertigo of free falling, and could hear himself screaming. He could feel his own hands grasping his head, but the darkness was all he saw. The countless thoughts and feelings, thousands of faces familiar and not, assaulted him from all sides, and he struggled with all of his will to fend off the urge to give up the pain and let his brain break. It was too much. He wanted to die, but he pushed and strained his mind to focus. "I will die if I must. But not Leothran. Not Leothran." Hundreds of images of creatures raced past his view, many strange and foreign, and he could feel they were a part of Leothran. He imagined the gorgeous red dragon that he had flown upon, the scales on her body and the large leathery wings and strong tail. He focused on the feelings sailing through him that he knew belonged to Leothran. He sifted through the chaos searching for the dragon, swimming and clawing through the din, and willed her to change so hard he thought his mind would tear asunder. Then all was quiet again. Anselm felt his head hit stone and became aware of the metal on his forehead, colder than ice. He opened his eyes and saw a blur of orange torchlight and shapes of men running past and over him. A familiar shadow covered his vision, and he could hear a voice that sounded like an echo from across a canyon chasm. "Ansel, brother." He saw her hands form a hex of protection, and then all was dark once more. Palsson watched the shadow walker as she tumbled through the air toward the ground 50 spans below, with wide eyes and tight lips at what he had done. He felt no remorse, but neither the sweet savor of achieving a long-awaited victory. About halfway to the ground, however, a light burst out of the woman, and he clutched the stone of the wall in surprise. He saw her form disappear, and in its place a gigantic mass expanded seemingly from nothing. It had wings and a tail, and an enormous head with a gaping mouth of sharp teeth. He heard gasps all around him and shouts down below of men who were watching. They all yelled as the dragon crashed lifeless to the ground, shaking the wall and sending a few people to their knees. The beast hit the earth and rolled onto one side, her giant shape taking up nearly a quarter of the distance from the wall to the river. Her wings hung down by her side but twitched and waved ever so slightly. She was still alive. Palsson slammed his fists on the wall. He turned away to grab his sword from the stone floor, and saw that every man and creature fighting for the Crimson Sun were now in a full retreat. The battle was over, and Talgarth had lost. Rage spun from frustration for the turn of the battle, the Shadow Walker's escape from death, and his overall presence in the middle of a war in Faldesia burst out of him in a mighty roar, and he swung his sword in the air shouting challenges to Talgarth and fate. Completely at a loss, he started running also, looking for a rope or ladder that was still intact. In his vexation, he didn't even notice the warden woman, standing close to the ledge of the wall with her hands in a hex, focusing with every fiber of her being to control what she was doing. Down below, fighters from both sides rushed the body of the dragon, some to attack it, others to only see what it was and where it came from, but none of them could reach her. A barrier of protection surrounded the ruby dragon's mass, a barrier that only a sage could conjure. As Palsson ran on, his mind busily attempted to find the best course of action. He thought he could disguise himself as a Faldetian and stay where he was and form a plan from there, but decided he did not want to be near the city or that dragon any longer. He was through with this place. He thought of returning to Talgarth with what was left of his armies. What would the Queen think? What would Lord Marmius say or do to him? Would he suffer the same fate as his former superior Verfold? He found himself not caring at the moment. Perhaps death would not be so bad. He concluded at last that he would at least begin the journey back to the Estelans, but once he reached the shores would go his own way south toward home. He would find a way to kill them all. His footfalls stopped short when he heard a familiar voice shouting in his direction. "Kerr, get over here and help me," came the voice of Mayor Zuck. Palsson walked to the wall's edge and saw the half-gruel on the other side clinging with one bulging arm to a protruding stone. His other arm was torn open and his mouth was frothing. "Help me up. These human scum won't defeat me. Hurry," he ordered. "I can't hold forever." Palsson looked into Mayor Zuck's yellow eyes and his stomach twisted as it always did, although this time his well-honed self-control had been expended beyond its limits. He reached down with his free hand and took a handful of Mayor Zuck's shirt and lifted him as high as he could, bringing their faces close together. "You, my comrade," Palsson said, "were among the casualties of this war." Mayor Zuck roared in anger, and tried in vain to take a bite out of Palsson before he brought his sword down onto the creature's hanging arm and severed it. He watched Mayor Zuck's body plummet to the ground, and land unfortunately onto one of the only jagged boulders protruding from the grass below. The Battle of Paladar was over. The invaders never breached the wall, but devastation reigned and thousands of bodies littered the expanse before the city as the Faldetian mist settled in for the night. Among the sea of bodies a lone man roamed. He was disturbingly tall, with pale skin and sunken eyes, and wore a tightly pulled hood over his head. Behind him trailed a snarling Fendara. Watching the battle from afar confirmed the man's last question. The Rembrandt he was searching for, the one carrying the sword, was not here. And that meant he was indeed on his way to Talgarth, just as his master had predicted. Satisfied he had accomplished his mission in the Westerlands, he wandered and disappeared into the haze and was gone long before morning came hours later.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.